Welcome to Engineering Influence, a podcast from the American Council of Engineering Companies, and we are in an election year, and things are heating up, coming to you in June, right before the party primaries, and what we're looking at is a couple of months of a hard-fought battle between President Trump, former President Trump, and President Biden, and of course, everything else going along with that, congressional elections and the like. And it's an election year. It's a political year. Last month, we just held our 2024 convention and legislative summit here in Washington, really focused on those issues. And one of our speakers was Kevin Kosar. He is a senior researcher at the American Enterprise Institute here in Washington. And Kevin's focus is really on the structure of government, how our government works, and really the nuts and bolts of our elections. A really timely topic, and very happy to be joined by Kevin today to kind of extend on those comments at the convention and to go into kind of areas of possible reform that we want to be looking at with our elections. So, Kevin, thank you very much for joining us.
Jeff, thanks for having me.
You covered a lot of ground in your presentation, not only with the state of the electorate, which seems to be fairly dissatisfied with the current two-party system and really just the structural aspects, going from primaries to, the way that we're kind of closed in with choosing candidates in primary systems that really favor, of course, the more extreme or more polarizing figures to kind of go with the party faithful. And then you get to the general and you see dissatisfaction kind of growing with those choices. And you kind of framed it really well. It's an interview process, it's a hiring process that we have for elected leaders, and the process is kind of broken. Explain that, like how you view that as kind of the job interview for government and where things are.
Sure. Well, we like to say that elections have consequences, but it's important to realize that how we structure elections also has consequences, most fundamentally for who decides to run, what their incentives are when they're campaigning, and then what their incentives are if they actually win in terms of how they govern. And I think there's a lot of evidence that the American public is frustrated by what they're seeing, particularly at the national level, and particularly in the House of Representatives. They see people who were somehow elected but don't seem to be speaking for the average voter out there. Instead, they take stands that are very far to the left or very far to the right. They spend an awful lot of time just heaping insults upon one another and keeping each other at arm's length, with the result being that some of the toughest issues are nation's finances and the horrific debt we have, the immigration situation, other high salience issues just aren't being resolved. Instead, they're just being used to campaign upon. And, I think it's tempting for us as voters to look at Washington and want to throw rocks and say that these people are not doing their job. I can agree with that, but they're also following the incentives as they see them. They're following the electoral incentives, and they're trying to get reelected. You and I both know the person who is not seeking to get reelected on Capitol Hill can often be a real truth teller because they just don't care.
Yeah, they don't care anymore. And that's when Mitt Romney is a good example, right? I think that his ability to now just say whatever he wants because he's lame up, he doesn't have to worry about it anymore. He's going to be going. Yeah, you see that all the time where members who actually have the freedom to start talking and saying things that otherwise they wouldn't. And it does seem, in my time in Congress, at least, in the later part of the Obama administration and then leading into some of the early, Trump years, it was always partisan, but it seemed to become ultra partisan. And you saw this kind of move to the fringes as the bases of each party were more active. And you saw either it was the Iraq War that really kind of got the left very active during the Bush administration, and then that kind of kept on going through the Obama, and then of course the reaction to Obama with the right. And it seemed to be that the incentives were always just moving further to the extreme. And we want to talk to the people who are the most extreme and generally more active on the party side. The primary systems that we have, do you think that's one of the more, salient reasons for this?
Yeah, definitely. It plays a real role in the candidates we get and the governance we get. Look, one of the longstanding virtues of a two-party system is that if you want to win, if you as a party member want to win, your party has to appeal to a majority.
Yeah.
Or at least a majority of those who vote. So it's a very strange thing to find ourselves in a situation where most Americans don't have a particular affection for either party.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in my home state of Ohio, voters, when they go to register to vote, they can pick Democrat, Republican, nothing else, or just nothing. 77% pick nothing.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want anything to do with either of the two brands.
Yeah.
So that's a real market response telling us that the party's behavior is repugnant in many ways. So why are the parties doing this? Why aren't they trying to get a majority?
Mm-hmm.
Well, because they figured out how to play the game well. And to play the game well means to win the primary. And then if you've got a state or a district that's somewhat sorted, somewhat polarized, if your party's got the majority, then you're just going to coast. You don't have to worry about wooing the other side in any way, shape, or form. And then 2 years later, you get to run that play all over again.
Mm-hmm. What about, and then of course you get into the redistricting and gerrymandering. I mean, really historically, how has that played a role? And what was the role in that gerrymandering or redistricting to favor one party to really get a plus R or a plus D district? I mean, it's always happened, right? But how is it different today than maybe it has been in the past?
Well, I should mention, we know that gerrymandering is having some effects. Two pieces of evidence. One, the parties spend gobs and gobs of money to do it because they believe that they can eke out better odds to win. And number two, when you look at the Senate versus the House, the Senate can't be gerrymandered because it's based on states.
Yes.
And not surprisingly, the Senate tends to be a more collegial body than the House. Yeah, I think the big change that we've seen is that everybody who's involved with redistricting or gerrymandering has gotten better at it. 50 years ago, you would have politicos sitting around in a state with maps, with other smart people who knew the population and the local cultures, and they would sit and try to do things on paper and carve them up. Now they've got big data. And they know how to figure out, based upon this issue or that issue, how to move a border or boundary just a little bit one way or another. Doesn't have to be a huge amount, just enough to get up to 51, 52, 53. And that's all it takes.
I mean, you look at the map and you might say it makes no sense, right? When you look at it visually, like how could this district exist? Well, especially the ones that have like a 1 mile cord that attaches it to the other part of the state. But you're right, because it becomes a data question. As we have more data, professionals are able to parse that and get down to the really granular area where they can actually inoculate themselves against, any other party.
I mean, it's a real weapon for gaining seats in the House of Representatives. For example, last time around, Illinois Democrats have a majority, and they engaged in the redistricting exercise, and they took two sitting members of the House who both were in Republican districts and merged them into a district and made them run against each other. The result was that the conservative yet more well-tempered individual, Rodney Davis, he lost to somebody who was more of a fire breather. So the Democrats on the one hand won, but they ended up making the House a little less collective.
And that was, I remember that because Rodney's a friend. He when he was in the House, he was always in contact with us on a lot of issues on T&I, and he was looked at as a future chairman of the committee, and it was someone who was well respected on both sides. I do remember that argument of saying that, listen, you might lose a Republican, you might win a seat, but actually you're at net loss because you're losing someone who could actually work with you on pushing legislation. I think it goes to your point of the victory is more important than the end result in the chamber, because they're not focused on what happens in chamber operations. Having a House that actually operates is a numbers game, and it always is. It's who has the majority. If you don't have the majority, you can't control the chamber. That's all that matters.
And it does feel a bit like a winner take nothing exercise, because if you're a party and you win control of the House, these days it's probably going to be nominal control. You're not going to have a 50-seat majority like you would long, long ago. But inevitably, the upper chamber or the White House is going to be in the hands of the other party. So what have you really gained by kind of running to your far left or far right? What you've gained is not much capacity to actually govern. And I should mention for listeners out there, you brought up primaries, which is so important. The reason primaries are a factor affecting what we get in terms of governance and the quality of candidates is that only about 20 to 25% of eligible voters turn out in primaries. And when you look at the people who turn out, they're very frequently single issue voters, people who are on the hard left, on the hard right, folks with axes to grind, sometimes outright cranks. And so if they're doing the first selection of who gets to be on the general ballot come November, is it any wonder that your average voter is showing up to the booth and going, I'm not sure I care about either of these guys.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's and I don't know, you know, there have always been those hot topic issues that have always driven the national conversation, but it has become reductive, where it's always the same kind of issues, and it's always the same kind of issues that the campaigns can try to get some play on and energize that base of voters to come out to the primary. And you're right. I mean, you know, especially states with closed primaries that don't give you the option, right? That you're just forced in here and you have to choose amongst, you know, only a select few in your party. At the end of the day, in the general election, that's a whole different electorate than the primary voter.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And breaking out of the primary model, the partisan primary model, has been one of the pushes that various reformers have aimed for. Some are going for open primaries. Some are looking to restructure the way you vote within the primary, as opposed to just picking one candidate. You can rank them or approve of multiple candidates. Just trying to restructure things in ways so that maybe you get people who are more interested in appealing to a broader swath of the public.
Let's talk about those reform options, because there are, you know, many opportunities for reform out there. Well, you know, you mentioned kind of ranked choice voting. You mentioned, you know, of course, open primaries. You have the kind of the issue of kind of the more competitive process, and just, you know, having, you know, 50+1, you win. It's going to be more of a ranked order. Like, what's working, what doesn't, what seems to be the most opportunistic area for reform, and where do you see in the country that really taking shape?
So the reform movement is kind of a many-headed animal. Often fighting with itself. You have those who say ranked choice voting is absolutely the way to go. And there are states like Maine, for example, which uses ranked choice votings to the congressional level. There are other places that say, no. You know, the way to tackle the primary problem in this small subset of voters being piled in there is to just open the two partisan primaries. So you still run two party primaries, but voters can flow to whichever one they want to vote in. Others still have said, you know, look, and this you see it particularly in Louisiana, which back 50 years ago, they decided to go with a single primary, the so-called jungle primary, where every party's got to run in it together. And if you get more than 50%, like you're in, congratulations. If you don't, the top two end up running off against each other. California has also done a kind of top two system where they try to get the most candidates with the most vote share get to move on to a general election. But it's a tough thing to work with, not least because when you're talking about scheduling a primary, if your general's in November, who wants to turn up and vote in August or July, even early September, when your kids are going back to school or work is getting started up again and you're doing that seasonal shift? I mean, it's just hard to get the turnout you need.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've seen lower turnout. Turnout continues to go down, even though, as you said in your presentation, voter access has increased, but turnout has gone down. Is there the appetite for an eternal campaign where you get to a point where you do have this runoff and then it goes longer and you select your candidate and then you move towards the fall? It seems as though in an election year, it just is that entire year. You know, what are your thoughts on the American electorate's appetite for an extended voting process?
It's limited. I mean, look, I'm professional student of Congress and elections, and I'm already exhausted with the presidential election between Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. And it's like, oh boy, we get to do another 4 months of this? 5 months, something?
Haven't the conventions yet.
And this is, so your average member of the public doesn't have a lot of appetite for that. I mean, I think it's possible you could try to do a springtime autumn split. You know, if you ran some sort of all-in jungle primary in the spring and then had the 2, 3, 4, even 5 candidates who go forward, and they can spend the rest of the summer campaigning, building up their supporter bases, and then they run off in the November election. Or you just do like New Orleans. You just move the primary all the way into the autumn, and then boom, if somebody gets that 50%, we're done. If you have to do a runoff, you do it a few weeks later, kind of strike while the area is hot, and hopefully can get people back out. But it's not an easy situation, that's for sure.
Yeah. What about voter security and the security of our elections? I mean, I just have this feeling that no matter what, happens, it's going to be called into question, right? The election was stolen before it even happened. I have an idea. As a student of elections, how secure are we, and what are the areas that you think are actual areas of concern when it comes to, vote security?
Well, I think the actual casting of ballots is pretty darn secure. When the controversies arose over the 2020 presidential election, one of the things that was striking to me is that so few Americans were just simply unaware that ballots have barcodes.
Yeah.
And these are matched against the electronic voter roll. So the idea that somebody could get issued multiple ballots and vote multiple times, like this doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
It doesn't work unless you're actually taking somebody else's ballot. So yeah, when it comes to actual fraud in the casting of ballots, it seems very few incidents occur. And when they occur, they're not enough to swing an election.
Yeah.
We've had that rare one back in the Carolinas where there was some serious corruption about, was that 10 years ago that happened or more? But that's the exception that proves the rule. Now, tabulation is the other side of it.
Yeah.
Do people understand how the votes get counted? And do they trust in the counters? And that's a real tough problem, because if you have political actors, individuals who are going around saying, I saw they were throwing some ballots in a dumpster. How do you inoculate the public against those sorts of claims?
Especially in the day of social media, where the simple claim is spread across the country in a millisecond.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where I tell my friends who love ranked choice voting that the voting aspect of ranked choice is very straightforward. Everybody knows what it's like to look at a menu and say, I'll take this for my entree, but if they don't have that, I'll take this instead. And this is my ranking. They get that. But the counting is a little complicated, and it's going to require lots of voter education so that people don't get confused about it and don't get exploited by bad actors.
Yeah.
Other reforms are no problem with that count. I mean, open primaries or getting rid of primaries and going with just conventions.
Yeah.
These things are perfectly understandable, and I don't think they're going to rattle anybody's confidence.
Voter education is a big part of it, because when it comes down to it, elections are run by the states, and the people who are running the elections and actually physically operating, counting on the day, checking IDs, all that, generally are volunteers. Right? We have a system where Americans volunteer to make sure our elections happen. But outside of the election and going and spending, let's say a half an hour if you have a line, every so often, people don't pay attention to elections. I mean, what should we be doing a better job of just regular voter education? I mean, just the general civics of kind of our system of government relies on an active participatory, electorate. We don't really have that. I mean, what should happen to kind of help educate people so they wouldn't see a social media message and go, oh my God, they're stealing the election?
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is a huge, huge project.
Yeah.
And I think first and foremost, it's going to have to be carried out in local communities. And it should start high school civics classes.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no reason that you can't have students in the 11th, 12th grade U.S. government class go down and visit their local voting office, not only learn how to register to vote, but also look under the hood.
Yeah.
These are the machines. Here are the optical scanners. Learn about voter rolls, all that sort of thing. I think the people in elections administration are more than happy to do that, but traditionally they haven't had to do a lot of that. Public education has not been part of their role. But as you mentioned, the presence of social media has changed everything for everybody.
Yeah.
You can no longer sit back and assume that you can be trusted. You have to get out there and actively educate to inoculate against that the attacks that are going to come. I also think that, there may be a role for the federal government to offer a grants program. I get a little nervous about that because they often want to put strings and get directive.
Yeah.
But a lot of communities don't have a lot of money to spend on elections administration. It really is, as you indicated, kind of a amateur effort.
Yeah.
You have a few professionals who work year round to run the office, but then it's all dependent on volunteers showing up, learning how things work. And that's fine. That's great to be able to participate in it, but we rely so heavily on volunteers. Might be nice if we just up the percentage of professionals in the room so that we are less likely to have errors that suddenly explode on social media and people get all wound up about an election being stolen.
And it's interesting because there are groups and organizations that are, from the United States, Republican Institute and others that go across the world and try to help countries or democracies, emerging democracies, strengthen their systems. It doesn't seem like we're interested in doing it ourselves. We have this feeling that, we're America and we are a functional democracy. We're a constitutional republic and we're fine just because we are. But it's not the kind of thing that you can just leave unattended.
No. I mean, our Constitution has made it a tradition that states and localities, are largely in control of how elections get set. The Constitution does say the feds can step in, and certainly at the federal level elections, but mostly it's been leave it to the states and the localities. And that's great. That's all well and fine. You don't want a federal machine that's in control of everything and doing all accounting. It's better to keep the power fragmented, but professionalizing the system is an enduring challenge.
Yeah.
There are just parts of this country where the elections are just notoriously poorly run. I mean, would I want to run in Cook County, Illinois? I don't think so. There are parts of Georgia where just slapdish operations. Other places, the local party machinery is so dominant.
Absolutely. Philadelphia, I mean, my own area, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's why, if you're a Republican running in Philadelphia, what's the point?
Yeah.
It's like kind of the joke. It's because it's not a question of corruption. It's just corruption. It's more the party machine is so strong in that area that in no way are you going to be able to be successful.
We have the same thing here in Washington, D.C. I think the last time an actual Republican served on the city council, I want to say was maybe around 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Since then, it just hasn't occurred. Everybody runs as a Democrat, a Green, or something else.
Yeah.
And Republicans, they can't even raise money in this town.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, there is a piece of legislation to structurally reform DC elections to kind of open up the system and employ ranked choice voting. And no surprisingly, the dominant Democratic Party is just heaving rocks at it.
Yeah, exactly.
See their power being threatened.
Yeah. I guess that's the biggest thing is just the question of just its power. And it's just the system is, people will divide the system to amass and protect their own interests. And those don't always align with the interests of the public at large. So it really does come down to education and kind of a do-it-yourself kind of thing to the point where you raise, school kids going down and taking a look at your local election office. I mean, there's no reason why any individual can't do that, right? They can all go down and take a look and ask questions and see how it operates.
Yeah, it's very easy to get schooled up on how elections work. You just have to be willing to put time in. And then in terms of transforming, if you are in DC and don't want to be voting for a Democrat every single time, whether your politics are further left or to the right, you're just going to have to get active and go in and change the party itself. That's the interesting thing I learned when I was talking to some of the people involved in reform movements around the country. Frequently, reformers come from outside the parties. They're independents who are tired of being ignored. But also they come from inside the party. They think their party's been taken over by an extreme faction of one sort or another. And this is their way of fighting back. Change the electoral system in order to disempower these people who they think are a minority and not good for the long-term interest of the party as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. What are your thoughts on November so far, sitting here today in June? What kind of campaign do you think is going to be?
I presume it's just going to get uglier and uglier. We know the social science that
people's brains tend to be activated more by fear and anger.
Yeah.
And so the campaigns, each side faces a real challenge in getting turnout.
Yeah.
I mean, who on the Democratic side feels really excited for Mr. Biden?
Yeah.
Some people do, but others are kind of like, well, what you do is you run ads at them saying if Trump wins, it's the end of democracy. Yes. All sorts of atrocities will occur. You scare the bejesus out of them and you get them. Same thing goes on the other side.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people on the right who just don't want to see the Trump show anymore. They're tired of it.
Yeah. But the option, they're like, well,
that's how we turn them. That's how we turn them out. We're going to keep showing videos of the border. We're going to show a mess of our finances. We're going to show all sorts of things. You know, scare the daylights out of them.
So it's going to be a fun time. It's going to be very optimistic.
It's going to be, it's going to be great.
Yes. Well, and it's going to be even greater just being in the city and watching it all happen. And just seeing what happens also with Congress. I mean, yeah, who knows? But yeah, there's a lot. I think we should reconnect when we get closer to November and see where things are. Maybe also throw in what's happening in Europe into the mix as well. It seems as though Macron just dissolving the Republic and getting ready for new elections, given the fact of the Le Pen and the percentage that the right's gotten in France, Germany, Denmark. Farage is back in the EU Parliament. I mean, it seems like things are just, everything's cyclical and we're turning right back to where we were maybe a decade or so ago.
It's very, very disruptive times, and more, at least in the American context, it reminds me of the late 19th century where politics just suddenly became really unpredictable.
Yeah.
And you had parties being transformed from inside and power shifting all over the place and a lot of hot feelings flying.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, Kevin, there's going to be a lot more to talk about, but I do appreciate you coming on the program.
Jeff, thanks for having me.
And again, that was Kevin Kosar with the American Enterprise Institute. And this has been Engineering Influence, a podcast from the American Council of Engineering Companies. We'll see you next time.